Picture this. Toronto Massey Hall, 1923. Every seat taken. People standing in the aisles, pressed against the back walls, spilling out onto Shooter Street, hundreds more wait in the cold, hoping somehow to get inside. A woman walks onto the stage. No announcement, no introduction. She doesn't need one. She is small, dark-haired, dressed in a white dress that seems almost to glow under the stage lights. She raises both hands toward heaven. The crowd goes absolutely silent. And then, without any signal, without any dramatic command, a man in the third row stands up. He had walked in with a cane. He walks out without one. A woman near the back begins weeping, touching her own throat, saying over and over that the pain she has carried for 11 years is simply gone. A child, brought in by her desperate mother, opens eyes that doctors had declared permanently damaged. She looks around the hall with wonder, seeing faces clearly for the first time. The woman on stage doesn't take credit. She never does. She points upward and says what she always says. Not me. Never me, this is God. Her name is Aimee Semple McPherson. By the time she died, she had preached to more people than any woman in the history of North America. She had built a church that seated 5,000. She had her own radio station, her own Bible college, her own denomination. She had fed tens of thousands during the Great Depression when the government couldn't. She had been called a fraud, a genius, a saint, and a scandal. Newspapers across the continent couldn't stop writing about her. But here is what almost no one remembers now. Before all of that, she was a 19-year-old widow, alone in a foreign country, with a newborn baby in her arms and no money, no home, and no plan. She had already lost everything once, and she would lose everything again. This is the story of a girl from a small Ontario farm who became the most famous woman preacher in the world. A story of grief so deep it nearly swallowed her whole, of choices that shocked an entire generation, of a woman who kept getting back up again and again, long after anyone else would have stayed down. Salford, Ontario, October 9th, 1890. She wasn't born into anything remarkable. The farm outside Salford was modest, the kind of place where the seasons determined everything, and nobody had much to spare. Her father, James Kennedy, was a quiet, methodical man who worked the land without complaint. Her mother, Minnie, was something else entirely. Minnie Kennedy had been raised in the Salvation Army, and she carried that fire with her everywhere she went. She prayed out loud. She sang hymns while she worked. She believed, without a single doubt, that God was real and present and paying attention. The baby born that October was named Aimee Elizabeth Kennedy. She came into the world in a farmhouse in Oxford County, and from her very first years, she was her mother's daughter in the ways that mattered most. Dramatic, certain, impossible to ignore. Aimee was the kind of child who turned everything into a performance. She would stand on the barn fence and preach to the chickens. She organized little plays for the neighbors, cast herself in the leading role, and directed everyone else with absolute authority. A childhood friend later said, without any particular unkindness, that Aimee simply assumed the world was watching her, and she was determined to give it something worth seeing. But under all that energy, she was wrestling with questions that didn't have easy answers. The small Methodist church in Salford said one thing, the textbooks at school said another. By the time she was a teenager, Aimee Kennedy had begun to doubt. She wrote letters to the newspaper, she argued with her teachers. She wanted someone to tell her the truth, and she wasn't sure anymore where to find it. She was 17 years old when she met Robert Semple. He came through Ingersoll on an evangelistic tour, a young Irish Pentecostal missionary with dark eyes and an absolute conviction that could fill a room. Aimee went to his meeting intending to be skeptical. She had sharpened her arguments on the walk over. She was ready to disagree with everything he said. She never got the chance. Something happened to her that night. She described it years later in language that never quite captured the reality of it, because the reality was too large for language. She said it was like being struck and held at the same time, like being broken open, like every question she had carried for years being answered not with words, but with something that bypassed words entirely. She went home that night a different person. Not because of anything Robert Semple said, though she would fall in love with him soon enough, but because of what she encountered in that little church in Ingersoll on a January evening in 1907. She knew immediately that her life had changed direction. She knew the way some people simply know things, that she was called to preach. Her mother was thrilled. Her father was uncertain. The community was, at best, puzzled. It didn't matter. Aimee had made up her mind. She married Robert Semple in August of 1908. She was 17. He was 22. They had almost no money and enormous faith, and a plan that most people in Salford would have called reckless. They were going to China. They were going to be missionaries. They were going to give their lives to something bigger than themselves. Minnie Kennedy stood at the door of the farmhouse and watched them go. She was proud and frightened in equal measure, though she showed only the pride. China in 1910 was not what the mission board pamphlet suggested. Hong Kong was crowded and sweltering, nothing like the Ontario countryside, where Aimee had spent every year of her life. The heat alone was a kind of assault. The language was impossible, the work was slow, painstaking, often discouraging. Robert and Aimee set up their small mission and began the long, hard labor of learning how to be useful to people, whose world was entirely different from their own. For a while it was hard and holy and exactly what they had chosen. They were together. They were doing what they believed they were meant to do. And then Robert got sick. It started as something that seemed manageable. Malaria. People got malaria in Hong Kong. People recovered from malaria. But Robert did not recover. He got worse, and then worse again. And then one morning in August of 1910, he died. He was 29 years old. Aimee was 8 months pregnant. She was alone in a foreign country. She had no money. She had nowhere to go. She didn't speak the language well enough to navigate the grief she was drowning in, let alone the practical catastrophe of her situation. She was 19 years old, and the person she had built her entire life around was gone. 6 weeks after Robert died, she gave birth to their daughter. She named the baby Roberta Starr. The middle name was her own small act of faith, that something luminous could still exist in the darkness she was living inside. Have you ever been that alone? Have you ever had the ground simply disappear beneath you, not slowly but all at once, and found yourself falling with nothing to hold? That was Aimee, in a small room in Hong Kong in 1910, with a newborn in her arms and no one who could help her. She made it back to Canada. She is not entirely sure, even in her later telling of it, how. Her mother helped. The mission board helped. There was charity from strangers, and she accepted it without pride because she had no room left for pride. She arrived in New York, sick and broke and heartbroken, and she tried to begin again. She tried for 3 years. She really did. She moved in with her mother in Salford. She took a second husband, Harold McPherson, a kind and practical man from Providence, Rhode Island, who offered her stability and a conventional life. They moved to Providence. She had another child, a son named Rolf. She kept the house and raised the children and went to church on Sundays and tried very hard to be the person that life seemed to be asking her to be. And it was killing her, not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, steadily, like a light being turned down bit by bit until the room is almost dark. She couldn't explain it to Harold, who was a decent man and had done nothing wrong. She couldn't explain it to anyone, really. How do you tell someone that you are drowning in a perfectly ordinary life? That the very safety of it feels like suffocation? That you are called to something, and the calling won't let you go no matter how hard you try to set it down? She got sick. Seriously, genuinely sick. The kind of sick that doctors couldn't quite diagnose, but that her body clearly meant. She was in and out of hospitals, surgery, complications. She lay in a hospital bed in Providence in 1915 and honestly believed that she was dying. And in that hospital bed, she made a decision. She said yes, not to Harold, not to the house in Providence, not to the sensible, quiet, ordinary life that had been offered to her and that she had genuinely tried to live. She said yes to the thing that had been calling her since that January night in Ingersoll when she was 17 years old and everything changed. She got out of the hospital bed. She called her mother. She told Harold that she was leaving to preach. Harold, to his credit, tried to understand. He couldn't. The marriage did not survive. She would carry that grief, that guilt, for the rest of her life. She never pretended otherwise. Aimee Elizabeth Semple McPherson packed 2 suitcases, took her daughter and her son, and got in a car. She had $100. She had a tambourine. She had a tent she didn't yet own and a plan that existed mainly in her faith. She was 25 years old, a single mother of two, twice married, twice changed by grief, and absolutely certain that God was not finished with her. The tent meeting started small. Florida. Then north through the Carolinas. Then up into New England. Aimee would arrive in a town, find a field or a park or a sympathetic church, put up a notice, and start preaching. The word spread faster than she expected. She had a gift that is very difficult to describe and nearly impossible to manufacture. When Aimee preached, people felt seen. Not flattered, not entertained, seen. She had a way of standing at the front of a room and speaking directly to the specific grief and specific hope that each person in that room was carrying. Even though she couldn't possibly have known what those things were, people would come in skeptical and leave in tears, not because she had manipulated them, but because something in her words had landed precisely where they needed to land. She preached salvation. She preached healing. She preached with her whole body, moving across the platform, using her hands, her face, her voice at full range. She had the dramatic instincts of a natural performer, but she put them entirely in service of the message. And audiences who had been to 100 dull church services found themselves holding their breath. She also had her mother. Minnie Kennedy had decided, somewhere around 1917, that her daughter needed a manager. Minnie was practical in all the ways Aimee was visionary, and together they were formidable. Minnie handled the bookings, the money, the logistics. Aimee handled everything else. It was not always an easy partnership. Two strong women with two different ideas about nearly everything. But it worked. By 1918, Aimee was filling auditoriums. In Philadelphia, city officials estimated 8,000 people tried to get into a hall that held 3,000. In San Jose, the mayor came to hear her preach. In Denver, the line stretched around the block for 3 days. Reports of healings followed her everywhere. A man who had walked with a brace for a decade left without it. A woman deaf from childhood began to hear. Aimee never orchestrated these moments. She didn't have healing lines where the afflicted came forward in dramatic sequence. She prayed. She declared, and sometimes, inexplicably, undeniably, things changed. She always said the same thing afterward. I didn't do this. I can't do this. I am just available. She was 30 years old and the most talked about woman preacher in North America. And then she decided to build a church. Los Angeles, 1921. Aimee chose the city deliberately. It was growing at a speed that made older American cities look static. It was the place where people went to start over, to be someone new, to find what they were looking for. It was, in some deep way, her kind of city. The Angelus Temple took 2 years to build and cost $1.5 million. Every dollar of it donated by the people who had heard her preach. It seated 5,300. It had a choir loft that held 100 singers and a stage equipped like a theater, because Aimee had decided, deliberately and unapologetically, that worship could be beautiful, that the truth could be presented with imagination and art. She produced what she called illustrated sermons, dramatic presentations, costumes, set pieces, music, that turned the Angelus Temple into something the city had never seen before. People called it showmanship. She called it the same impulse that had sent her to the mission field, just expressed differently. She wanted people to come. You cannot reach the people who aren't there. The newspapers couldn't leave her alone. She was a woman, which was already unusual. She was a divorced woman, which was more unusual still. She was a divorced woman who commanded the attention of thousands, raised millions of dollars, broadcast on her own radio station, KFSG, the first religious radio station in American history, and refused to be quiet or small or apologetic. She was everything that the established order of her era was not sure how to handle. She handled the press the way she handled everything. Directly, a little playfully, with an eye on the larger purpose. She gave them access. She cultivated them. She understood that attention, even skeptical attention, was not the enemy. Then came 1926. On May 18th, Aimee went for a swim at Ocean Park Beach in Los Angeles. And she vanished. The city went into a kind of collective panic that is difficult to overstate now, nearly a century later. Aimee Semple McPherson was, at this point, probably the most recognizable woman in California. Her disappearance from the beach was front-page news within hours. Her followers gathered at the water's edge and prayed. Boats searched the ocean. Divers went down. The vigil at Angelus Temple lasted for weeks, thousands of people praying continuously for a woman they believed to be dead. Minnie Kennedy wept publicly. Tributes poured in from across the continent. And then, 5 weeks later, Aimee walked out of the Arizona desert into the border town of Douglas, claiming she had been kidnapped. The world went absolutely wild. Her return to Los Angeles was the kind of spectacle that had no comparison. Aircraft circling, a motorcade, 50,000 people lining the streets. And then, almost immediately, the questions began. Investigators looked at the story she told and found it inconsistent. A man named Kenneth Ormiston, a former KFSG radio operator, had gone missing at the same time Aimee did. A cottage in Carmel had been rented under suspicious circumstances. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office convened a grand jury. The accusation, never proven but relentlessly repeated, was that Aimee had not been kidnapped at all, that she had staged her own disappearance to spend time with Ormiston, that the whole thing was a fabrication. The case was eventually dropped. No charges were ever filed. But the damage was not so easily dropped. Her reputation cracked. Not for everyone, not even for most of her congregation, who stood by her with a loyalty that astonished observers. But the story became her shadow. Every article about her carried it. Every skeptic used it. She spent the rest of her life under its weight. She never confessed to any deception. She maintained her story until she died. What the truth was, only she knew, and she took it with her. But here is what did not crack: the work. She came back to Angelus Temple, stepped back onto that stage and preached. The crowds came back. KFSG kept broadcasting. The Bible college she had founded kept training new ministers. And then the Depression came, and Aimee did something that cemented her legacy in a way that no single sermon ever could. She fed people. When the Great Depression hit Los Angeles, the city's systems buckled under the weight of need. Aimee turned Angelus Temple into a relief operation. The commissary she established was one of the largest in Southern California. By some estimates, it fed 1.5 million meals during the Depression years. Not to her congregation, to anyone who came. It didn't matter who you were or what you believed or whether you had ever set foot in a church. If you were hungry, you were fed. City officials, including those who had been her critics, acknowledged publicly that the Angelus Temple commissary was doing more for the city's desperate than government programs were. She didn't preach at the soup kitchen. She just fed people. A city official who had covered the grand jury proceedings against her, a man who had written some of the most skeptical coverage of the kidnapping story, was asked years later what he made of Aimee Semple McPherson. He paused for a long time before he answered. He said, "I spent a lot of years looking for the angle. I never found it. What I found was someone who actually believed what she said and who did something about it." The years after the Depression were not easy. Her relationship with her mother, which had always been complicated by the collision of two strong and equally certain personalities, finally broke apart entirely in the early 1930s. Minnie departed the ministry and gave interviews to the press that were not kind. The rupture was public and painful, and neither woman seemed to find a way across the distance that opened up between them. In 1931, Aimee married again. David Hutton was a singer, younger than she was, charming in ways that didn't wear well. The marriage was troubled from its beginning and ended in divorce in 1934. Her congregation forgave her. The press was less forgiving. The denomination she had founded, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, held together, though the years of personal turmoil left marks. Her children had complicated feelings about their mother, in the way that the children of visionary and driven people often do. They loved her. They were also, at various points in their lives, overwhelmed by what it meant to be her child. Roberta Starr, the daughter born in Hong Kong in the aftermath of the worst loss of Aimee's life, had her own faith, her own mind, her own eventual departure from the ministry her mother had built. Rolf stayed. Rolf, in time, would lead the Foursquare Church after his mother was gone. Aimee didn't slow down. Her health fluctuated. Doctors told her to rest, and she treated the advice with the same polite non-compliance she brought to most instructions she didn't intend to follow. She kept preaching. She kept traveling. She carried the stage presence that had always been hers, the ability to walk into a room and fill it. But by the early 1940s, it was accompanied by an exhaustion that she couldn't entirely hide. She had also begun to rely, in ways that she didn't acknowledge publicly, and that her closest staff tried to manage quietly, on the sedatives she had been prescribed years earlier for insomnia. It was not unusual. It was 1940s medicine, before anyone fully understood dependency. But it was a weight she was carrying, alone on top of everything else. She preached her last major revival in Oakland in September of 1944. The meetings ran for 4 nights. Several thousand people attended each night. She was 53 years old, and she gave everything she had, the way she always had, the way she could not quite stop herself from doing. On September 26, 1944, the morning after the final Oakland service, she was found unconscious in her hotel room. She had taken a fatal combination of medication. Whether this was accidental or intentional was never established with certainty. The coroner's report called it accidental. She was 53 years old. The Angelus Temple, when the news arrived, went into a mourning that those who witnessed it said was unlike anything they had ever seen. Not organized grief, raw grief. The kind that comes when something that was genuinely irreplaceable is gone. 40,000 people attended her memorial service. The Los Angeles Times, which had spent years treating her as a spectacle, wrote that the city had lost one of its most consequential figures. The four-square church she founded now spans more than 60 countries. The Angelus Temple still stands in Los Angeles, still in use, still doing the work she built it to do. The radio station she launched is still on the air. Here is what Aimee Semple McPherson proved, in a life that was too large and too complicated and too fully itself to be reduced to a single lesson. She proved that faith and failure are not opposites, that a person can be broken open by grief, make choices she later regrets, be misunderstood by her own era, carry wounds that never fully heal, and still do something in the world that outlasts her by a century. She proved that women have always been capable of this kind of leadership, even when the world around them insisted otherwise. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for it. She simply did the work and let the work speak. She was not perfect. She would have told you so herself quickly, with that directness that never left her. She made choices that cost her dearly. She hurt people she loved. She carried things she never fully put down, but she also fed 1.5 million meals to people who were starving. She built institutions that are still running. She preached to millions of people who came to her services, looking for something they couldn't name, and went home having found it. She died at 53, exhausted and complicated, and fully spent, having given everything she had. The girl from Salford, Ontario, who stood on the farm fence and preached to the chickens, who went to China at 18 and came back a widow at 19, who built a church with 5,000 seats and a radio station and a Bible college in a city that barely existed when she was born. That girl never stopped being exactly herself, all the way to the end. That is rarer than miracles. And it is worth remembering. If this story moved you, if you found something here that you needed today, leave a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you. And if you know someone who is in their own desert season, someone who is rebuilding after loss, or wondering if it's too late to begin again, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear. Subscribe to Circle of Voices for more stories like this one. Stories of real people, real faith, real failure, and what happens when someone refuses to give up.